Welcome everybody back to our first seminar of this term. We are delighted to have Anna Pulido-Rull, who is visiting us from Cambridge in this instance, but she's based at the University of Arkansas, as you can see. She finished her PhD at Harvard in 2012. She writes on maps and colonial paintings in Mexico, and she's currently finalizing her manuscript of her book based on her dissertation. So it is my pleasure to welcome Anna to our seminar today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming to this talk in the beginning of the semester. And I want to thank you, Natalia, for inviting me to give a talk on my work. And as Natalia was saying, I have been studying painted maps and manuscripts made by indigenous artists in the 16th century in Mexico, colonial Mexico or New Spain. And I am currently working on my book, which is on a corpus of maps known as land grants or Mercedes de Tierras. And let's see, maybe I can make this. Here is a sample of the paintings that I am working on. These paintings are kept today in the Mexican National Archives, or Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico. They used to be before the 70s, because these paintings were used as legal evidence for land distribution cases. Before the 1970s, they were folded into four and just stored with the rest of the case files. And then in 1977, the archives got funds to take out the maps, unfold them, and do some restoration and conservation to them. They are now kept on acid-free paper in a separate gallery in the National Archives. So these maps allow us to examine more closely how land distribution was carried out in colonial Mexico, and to have a better understanding of how indigenous communities were able to participate in legal proceedings over land. Native artists painted these maps to use them as evidence in legal proceedings, sometimes to support their claims for a tract of land, sometimes to negotiate the terms of a land grant, and sometimes to request land themselves. Therefore, these paintings are perhaps some of the first maps ever made of Mexico City and its Mexico and its rural areas, and in that sense, they are of much interest to the history of cartography. But they are also beautiful pieces of colonial art that speak to these new artistic trends in the colonial period in Mexico, and they are also legal documents, legal evidence. And for those of you who are interested in the institutions of the colonial world, these, both the painting and the case files are very interesting because they let you have a better understanding of the Spanish Empire's use of laws and judicial institutions in the Americas. In my presentation today, I am going to show you a couple of case studies that illustrate indigenous negotiations and how these images were used for legal proceedings. I will begin by describing how these proceedings were carried out using one case study as an example. On September 8, 1579, Alonso de Villanueva Cervantes, the mayor of Coatlinchan, a small town northeast of Mexico City, addressed the natives and Spaniards who were gathered in the atrium of San Miguel's church after Mass. In 16th century colonial Mexico, as I am sure happened in other viceroyalties in the Americas, the church constituted a space that brought together all the residents from each town, particularly on Sundays after the main Mass or Misa Mayor. It was a religious event, but it was also a time and place where Spanish authorities addressed and communicated relevant information to the town's population. So, all of these atriums were spaces for communication. Villanueva, the mayor, read to them an instruction sent by the viceroy, Martin Enriquez, notifying them that Jerónimo Treviño, a Spaniard from nearby Mexico City, had requested a tract of land to install 2 ranches for small cattle on the hill of Soquiaque, which fell to the east of the town. Since not all of those who were present spoke Spanish, it was still very recent. An interpreter translated the acordado into the local language, which was Nahuatl in this case. This instruction, commonly known as acordado, posed a serious threat to the natives because it fell on lands they had recently secured a property title for, and it would bring a large number of animals, at least 2,000 new heads, to an already overcrowded area. Most importantly, this request was part of an ongoing land distribution process that was slowly moving indigenous territories into Spanish hands. So if this is a map of the central valleys of Mexico from about the time when the Spaniards arrived, this is 1915, you got Lake Texcoco, most of which does not exist anymore, and here on the southwest you got Mexico Tenochtitlan or Mexico City, and the town of Coatlinchan is right here to the northeast. So Spaniards who were living in Mexico City found this area very convenient because they could go set up the ranches, and it was close enough to the Viceroyalty's capital. So the shores of Lake Texcoco were becoming more and more full of Spanish ranches. The situation, yes? Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to ask a question.
No, I have already half a dozen, but I can wait. Don't worry.
By the way, if you feel, if you have a question or if you'd like to know more about each one of the images, feel free to interrupt me and, ask me. It's nice to have a dialogue about these maps. So the situation worsened on the following day when another Spaniard, Pedro González de Avilés, who also lived in Mexico City, requested a grant for small livestock right next to where Treviño was petitioning his own. So on that same week, Coatlinchan witnessed 2 different legal proceedings unfold. And this is how the instruction or acordado begins. And I think this is really important, that's why I brought it to you. Because the viceroy asks to the mayor, and you will commission a painting of the town where the grant has been requested. And that is key to understanding why images were so important to these proceedings, because in other viceroyalties, you have the Mercedes program as well, but they do not necessarily ask for a painting of the land requested. And he gives some specifications, indicate other ranches that have already been granted, which are these tracts of land, state the distances that lay between the sites, and most importantly, once a painting has been made, you will sign it with your name and add your judgment affirmed by an oath. And you will send it to me with everything else so I can provide what is convenient. So the viceroy could not come to Coatlinchan to verify that the grant was fair, but he did have the painting to, verify the information gathered in the proceedings.
Sorry.
Yes.
That is for the claimant of who, because this bears the burden of a proof.
Mm-hmm.
So the authorities would request this from both parts, from a third party. Who would do the painting?
That is a very important question because sometimes this instruction came from the viceroy and the mayor read it out loud. So in some cases it was the Spaniards who made these diagrams with the painting, but in other cases native artists from each town got together and they created a painting for the proceedings. Sometimes they made the painting to defend their territories. Sometimes they would make an alliance with the Spaniard who was requesting the land. Sometimes they would make paintings for their own requests. So it all goes case by case, but you got a very wide variety of maps. It's in a way it's similar to another genre known as the relaciones geográficas. The instruction was there and it was official, but sometimes native artists made it and sometimes it was the Spaniards.
Yeah, but surely could be depending what's the litigation. But if this is approved, that is requested by the authority, the two parties would have the same. Would have to deliver a similar map, or
There was only one map per proceeding.
only one map. Okay, and that was not commissioned to a third party.
It was commissioned to somebody in the town.
But none of the parties in the litigation.
The parties could make the maps.
Okay.
And actually, that's what I wanted to say next. On the case files, there is no straight answer to this question because the case files almost never mention the painter, the moment when the painting was made, and of course the names. So everything that we can gather, I have gathered from piece by piece from different files, what I know. It's a little bit frustrating because you would like to know more. But in this case, for example, this is a painting from the town of Erimbo in Michoacán. And in this case, the files do say the name of the artist. His name was Andrés Zacari. And in the file, it says that the Spanish mayor called Andrés Zacari, sworn him he had to swear that he would represent a true picture of the land. And he also had him sign the painting. But this is very, very unusual. And then he also says the moment when he made the painting, and the Spanish mayor was looking at the artist as he made it. So in this case, it was very, very well supervised. But we don't know because most of the files don't even make reference to these names. And here also, I will describe the painting later, but here at the very bottom of the map, the Spanish corregidors said, "This is a true and faithful painting, and so I swear to God, according to the law, Felipe de Valdés." The two land requests from Coatlinchan, as all of these requests, belong to a widespread legal proceeding established in 16th century New Spain, known as Mercedes de Tierras, or land grants. Spaniards and natives who wished to obtain a tract of land for agriculture, herding, the building of a mill, or any other economic activity had to send a formal petition to the viceroy, and if he approved of the petition, he would send an acordado to the town's local authorities, asking them to start the proceedings. The land grant program sought to allocate the territory of New Spain among its dwellers in an orderly fashion and to prevent illegal occupation of the land. The Spanish crown realized that, they wanted to take control over land distribution because the Spanish conquistadors and the early generations, they wanted to prevent them from occupying too much territories in these first years. So in a 1550 royal decree, King Charles V stated that only the viceroy and the royal audience were entitled to distribute land and give out property titles. So it was very, very restrictive. And the native population of New Spain participated actively in the colonial legal system and benefited from its laws and institutions. This was possible, among other reasons, because Spanish law had made it a priority to protect the most vulnerable members of each city since the Middle Ages. And when they established their empire in the Americas, they used law as a means to protect the new subjects and to furnish them with an institutionalized means through which political and economic power could be expressed, negotiated, and also controlled. There is a very interesting study by Brian Owensby about Spanish law, both in Spain and in the Americas, where he says, and I quote, "It has been said that the Spanish Empire took shape under the inspiration of law. Perhaps no other conquest and colonization, certainly none in modern European history, made such a point of its laws and judicial institutions as did Spain in America. The system, as you can imagine, was not flawless, but indigenous communities used it throughout the colonial period as a means to voice their concerns, denounce abuses, and solve issues brought about by labor, tributes, or justice or land distribution." The land grant program was the most common means to obtain territory in colonial Mexico since 1535, So there is a large corpus of case files and over 600 maps kept today at the Mexican National Archives. These were painted between 1535 and 1601, and almost each one of the case files comes with its corresponding map, as I was telling you earlier. And as I mentioned to you before, only about 1/3 of these maps are paintings. You can also find many examples such as this one. This is another land grant from the town of Chocándiro in Michoacán. And just to give you an idea, this was probably done hastily and just as a formality. So you got here, this is an image of the town, and you got here the town's church, and some of the houses, the mountains around the town. And there is this path that connects the town to the rural area. And this is a site requested, so it is mostly text and it is only black ink on paper. And you will find many of these in the archives. However, in some cases, as I was telling you earlier, you got examples of indigenous maps that were, that show work, thought, effort. And what I argue I am currently working on my book on land grant maps, and what I argue is that in these particular cases, these maps were part of the indigenous community's response to these land distribution policies, and they constituted a spatial practice that allowed them to translate their own ideas about their space into visual form, and in some cases these maps and the communities, they could shape the local politics of land distribution. What I did is I examined a selection of land grant maps together with their corresponding case files in order to understand how they sometimes bolster indigenous claims and challenge the information provided by the witnesses. I will talk about the witnesses in a moment, but when you read the case files, you find they are following a legal formula, so when you read them, it's almost stale and repetitive, as a legal proceeding should be. And then you got the painting, which is saying it has its own visual narrative, which is complex. And it is very, very difficult to see the connection between what is happening on the map and what is happening on the case files. So what I do in my book is that I study the intertextuality between these two written and visual testimonies and try to understand what was the map doing, because even if the painting, even if after the trial it happened that they lost the land, which happened in many cases, you still got these paintings that are, giving a visual testimony of spatial understandings and, their own testimony of how these proceedings took place. And here you got some examples. I'm going to talk about a couple of them in a moment. Do you have any questions so far?
I have one.
Sure.
Is any relation between the complexity of the maps and the sketches with the importance of the plot or the value or the quality?
Sometimes it is in very controversial cases, for example, in areas that are completely overcrowded, there is more effort on behalf of the painter to render the land.
Not surprising. More valuable land.
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, as you get closer to the Valley of Mexico, there is more request for land, as opposed to other areas like the Sierra Norte or places up north that have fewer grants. So you have a lot of maps from this area around the Viceroyalty's capital, because the Spaniards wanted to go back and forth and move their products and sell. And I also wanted to say that the Viceroy's request for a painting is reflective of a wider use of native-made manuscripts for legal purposes in colonial New Spain. I don't know how much you know about the colonial period, but particularly in New Spain, in the pre-Columbian period, indigenous communities used to deal with legal matters visually. And when the Spaniards arrived to the New World, they incorporate this practice into their own legal system because it works. It helps overcome the language barrier, for example. And through these paintings, it is easier to communicate and express ideas. So it was not only in land distribution where paintings were used. If you examine that production of maps and manuscripts in Mexico, you will find many codices that were painted for the King of Spain, for example, by indigenous communities trying to obtain justice against Spanish bureaucrats. So you got a vast production of documents created to dialogue and communicate. Okay, so going back to the case of Coatlinchan, I'm going to continue with my case study to let you know how the legal proceedings unfolded. Land grant proceedings usually begin with a visit to the land. So in Coatlinchan, Mayor Villanueva visited Soquiaque Hill in Coatlinchan, accompanied by an assorted group of natives and Spaniards, among which you have the scribe, the interpreter, the petitioner, of course, the witnesses, local landowners, the native town's governor, members of the town council, noble Indians, and other community members. And how it took place this, I went to Coatlinchan as part of my research to try to, get a sense of the land and the spaces portrayed in the painting. And most of this discussion happened as they were walking around the land requested, and the scribe was recording everything that was going on. But all of this discussion happened while they were pointing at the desired tract of land. They were getting a sense of how many other ranches and cultivated fields had been already established in this area. So, there was a very important visual component in addition to the map. And during this visit, both parties stated their arguments in favor of and against the grant. As I mentioned to you earlier, the natives had a property title for the disputed land, granted to them by the former mayor 4 years earlier. They presented this document to Villanueva and explained that they had already set up the ranch and cultivated fields in this area. Moreover, they claimed that there was no more space for a new ranch because the Spaniards' livestock was never monitored, it trampled over their crops, ate their produce before it could be harvested, and they specifically requested the mayor to keep their property separated by 2,000 steps as was stipulated by law, and to measure this officially, these 2,000 steps. So this speaks to their knowledge of the Spanish legislation and the ordinances. Treviño, the petitioner, had an entirely different stance on the matter. He did not mention the property title or question its validity, but he argued that the native's response was excessive because he was not requesting land directly on their property but nearby. He explained that the natives' cattle ranch was located at a very safe distance. He also claimed that the natives did not have any cattle in their ranch and that they were renting their land to other Spaniards instead. So all of this was happening as they visited the land. And on the days that followed, Villanueva questioned the witnesses as well, who were surprisingly in strong support of Treviño's petition. And using an almost identical phrasing, they were saying that the land requested had never been in use, was empty, and had never been sowed. They also confirmed that the site requested was far away from the natives' houses and cultivated fields. The painted maps from this case, I think they not only describe the lands of Coatlinchan to Spanish authorities, they also carry on the discussions between Treviño and the natives presented above and offer a perspective on the matter. And here are the two paintings of this territory. They were possibly created after the visit to the land. On the left hand, you got the map for the first petition for Jerónimo Treviño. And these proceedings, as we know, took place between September 8 to 15, so it's a very short time. Sometimes when the cases were more complicated, they could go on for years, 2 years, 3 years, and the case file shows because you got a wide variety. Sometimes you get folios that are 100 pages long, and sometimes it's solved very quickly. And then on the right, you got the map painted for the second proceedings, which were carried out between September 9 to 18 for Pedro González de Arles. The natives created two separate paintings, one for each lawsuit, and as you may notice by the style of each painting, even though the layout is very similar, you could easily tell that it's the same tract of land. but it was done by two different artistic personalities. You can tell by the brushwork and the color palette and the style in general. The paintings are also very different in their materiality. Remember, we were talking about paper earlier. The map on the left, although it's hard to tell on the screen, was made on European paper that was possibly provided by the mayor at the moment. Whereas the painting on the left was done on indigenous paper. It's a paper called amate. Perhaps you have seen it before because it is still produced in Mexico, especially in the area of Puebla and San Pablito. This is a close-up of the paper just to give you an idea. So it was made from the bark of the Mexican fig. And it has this porosity, so yeah. And here it's not sized, so it's very easily, you can tell. So you got this. It's another uncertainty. Why was one map done in one type of paper and the other on another? The painters were sharing their pigments. I analyzed these paintings with ultraviolet light analysis, and the yellow pigment that you see on this map is very similar to the yellow pigment that you see here. So they were sharing. They were probably working together, and indigenous communities frequently had their own archives of maps, which they never showed to the Spaniards, so they were clearly using a same compositional model. This was a town of painters. We know of other maps, such as this one. I'm not going to go in detail as to this one, but Coatlinchan was known for its map production, and you have other examples from the same town. So just describing them shortly. The first map of Coatlinchan is oriented to the east. Many maps from this period are oriented to the east as opposed to the north. And what you can see here at the top are the slopes of Mount Tlaloc. I don't know, have you ever traveled to Mexico? So this is Mount Tlaloc. There are many ceremonial centers to the god of the rain on top. And here, using GIS software, I overlapped the map just to get a sense of where that church was and where the mountains laid. I also overlap it with a world imagery base map. So here, this is Coatlinchan today. It has not grown that much since the colonial period. It is still a very small town. So you can get a sense that here is the town, the slopes of Mount Tlaloc, and this is a rural area in dispute. If you have ever been to the Mexican Museum of Anthropology, have you ever seen the God of the Rain that it's right outside? It comes from Coatlinchan, and it was a very traumatic moment in its history because the monolith, the sculpture used to be somewhere around here between the two rivers, and the community opposed in the 1960s. They did not want the sculpture to be taken to Mexico City, but it happened.
Sorry, is that the representation of villages on the left?
This one?
Yeah.
These houses stand for the town of Coatlinchan. So this would be the church and these the houses of the town.
Uh-huh.
And to give you a brief idea, this is, as you can imagine, a representation of selected images from the town. So you got the two, you got the two rivers that go up to the map is clearly divided into the city and the rural area. And the emphasis, of course, is in the rural area because it's the place in dispute. You got here the Church of San Miguel and a gloss that says Coatlinchan. That's the only way we have to identify the town. And you got these two river branches and the footpaths. These two slopes in blue-green are elevations as if seen from above. Here you got a ravine. And this, in this area, is where the sculpture of Tlaloc was found. Here you got the natives' ranch. And this is a place where Treviño requested his grant, the hill of Soviaje. This gloss right here says this is where Jerónimo Treviño is requesting land. So this is the area in conflict. Do you have any questions about the painting? Or?
Where that road goes, it is a footpath or it's and where does it go?
It's a footpath that connects the town of Coatlinchan to Mount Tlaloc. the ceremonial
There's
center.
no other. It's a ceremonial center on top of that.
Mm-hmm. And they also connect the town with the countryside to move, the crops. So here, if you notice the top left corner of the composition, here is a close-up. There is, I don't know if you can see it, but here is a yellow patch that looks like a palimpsest on the map, and it is. And it was painted by, right next to the corral in the conflict area. So what I did is I used infrared reflectography to study the palimpsest underneath the yellow painting. And what I discovered was that the corral of the natives used to be a little bit closer to the site requested. And then in some moment of the proceeding, so here the infrared allows you to see underneath the layers of pigment. So you can see that, before the river was painted, the corral of the natives used to be right here. And then at some time during the proceedings, we do not know when and we do not know why, somebody deleted this corral, covered it up with a coat of opaque yellow pigment, and then painted a second corral farther north and farther west than was originally intended. It is a palimpsest. So I was, of course, curious because, as you can imagine, the case files do not mention when this happened or if it happened. But the land grant proceedings were so controversial in this particular case that it makes sense. This painting is telling us a little bit more about what was happening.
Now, what is the original size of the painting?
This painting is 60 by 42 centimeters.
Okay, so this bit is quite small.
It is quite small.
Mm-hmm. Enough to write, but yeah.
Yes, it is very small. Mm-hmm. However, it's one of the largest in size.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way, do you interpret the kind of texture on some of on here to indicate different types of terrain? Like is this supposed to indicate pasture versus wooded terrain, or is that part of the map?
Yes. This is, these blue-green shapes are elevations, so these are higher slopes, as you've seen from above. And the artist used color coding. He used different patterns and textures to differentiate tracts of land. I think, based on what I have read, that this pattern shows the area where the natives had a property title for. So this was included in this is what they were defending. And then the rest of the land has a different pattern of smaller green marks. So that is beyond. Pre-Columbian maps used to color code to separate the different types of terrain, but we do not have enough information to say with certainty what this color coding indicates. Only the elevations.
And what would be in the corral?
It was the natives. That's where they kept their cattle.
Okay, so it's cattle.
It's cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs.
Okay.
So, in other words, the original version of the painting presented a different view of the landscape, one that shortened the distance between the natives' ranch and the requested site, underscoring that a grant in this place was not viable because it was not an adequate distance away. This was in line with the natives' argument against the petition, but later on the painting, as you can see, was modified. In addition to this, the area above and below the corral has a series of glosses in Spanish that challenge how this space was originally represented. While the artist had depicted only one ranch, thus creating his own rhetoric, somebody added a list of 7 more. So here you got, after the painting was made, maybe the scribe, maybe the mayor, wrote, especially on top of the palimpsest, he wrote the word baldíos, which means vacant land. He wrote, he specified here La Estancia de los Indios, the natives' ranch, and then he added a list of agricultural farm units with the names of the owners, Martin Diaz, the plowed lands, of Alonso de Barrios right here, the plowed lands of unintelligible name, and lands of Alonso de Arana. So with this, the person is changing what the map wanted to say originally. In addition to these, the person who wrote the glosses, he also wrote the word baldíos, or vacant land, on 4 different areas of the map. Most noticeably here, on top of the palimpsest. So everything was covered up. Baldíos, 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 and baldíos. Baldíos, as you can imagine, is more reflective of a Spanish means of conceptualizing the land. According to historian Charles Gibson, to the Spaniards, lands without Indian residents could be categorized as vacant and thus available to Spanish intrusion. So here you got overlapping ideas over land distribution. So as we know, based on the case files and the paintings, it is really not possible to determine whether there were 7 more ranches in this area or if there was just one. And it is not possible to establish either what was the real distance between properties. But what we do know is that those who participated in the lawsuits reworked the painting, especially the conflicting area. And this might suggest that they wanted to create a painting. They were going to send this painting to the viceroy, so they wanted to have a painting that supported their particular argument. And as I mentioned to you before, there is really no mention about this in the case files. But this is the requested area, so it makes sense that this area was reworked so much. The second map of Quatlin Chan, which was painted only a couple of days later as part of the second proceedings, shows the same space, of course, because they requested land side by side. But however, if you examine the upper left area of the composition, you realize that there are important differences between both maps. And here you got a close-up of the area. So, whereas on the first map, you got the river, you got the 2 river branches running right next to one another, and then you got both paths. On the second painting, you got first the river, then the path, then the river, and then another path. And the distances between them has changed as well. On the second map, there is ample space between both river branches. If you look closely at this area, you can see that this map has palimpsests as well, so it was modified too during the proceedings. The 2 river branches used to be contiguous, as in the same map. So here you can still see traces of the original river right here. And not only that, if you notice closely this area that is bound by a red frame line, something was deleted here and covered up as well. And it was this cornfield. I took a photo from the front and the back of the map to show you. So, whereas it was deleted here, but when you look at it on the back, you can still see this little field where they used to grow corn. This cornfield was later on moved farther north and farther west, as on the first map. So here it was moved from this area to this area. So once again, you got changes on the map that change the map's rhetoric into evidence that seems to support the Spaniards' claim. So it is possible to suggest that someone, perhaps the mayor, instructed the artist to modify his painting before sending it to the viceroy together with the written records. Another possible explanation would be that sometimes during the proceedings, one of the artists, or perhaps both of them, or perhaps some members of the community, decided to negotiate with the Spanish petitioner instead of posting to the grant, and thus accepted to rework the maps, because this was done very precisely, and it was clearly done by an indigenous painter. It is not possible for us to know with certainty what happened during those days, and as the litigation unfolded, indeed, this is an inevitable problem we face when working with this kind of archival material. Most of the discussions between the parties involved took place as they walked through the land and argued, and a large part of these discussions were not registered on the case files. However, even if there is no means to verify the actual position of the corral or the cornfield, or if the artist modified the painting under duress or acted according to their own will, what we can assert after examining the palimpsest is that initially both parties wanted a map that supported their position, as the key areas were carefully reworked before sending them to the viceroy. And Villanueva granted both tracts of land to both petitioners in a matter of days, without taking exact measurements, even though the law required it and the natives had asked him to do so. The only way for the viewer to assess distance was through the painted maps, which he signed. And here I just got a close-up of Alonso de Villanueva's signature in the first painting and in the second painting. He also stated in his final verdict that the viceroy would be able to verify this by examining the map, as Your Excellency will verify by means of the painting I sent. The palimpsest suggests that the original version of the painted maps from Coatlinchan did not validate his testimony, and this automatically cancels the possibility of a straightforward reading of the map, especially in the context of this highly controversial land disputes. Do you have any questions about this map before I move on?
Fascinating.
So to give you a sense of perspective, I'm going to show you an example from another land grant proceeding. In the case of Coatlinchan, members from the indigenous community immediately opposed to the grant. So what I'm going to show you now is a map from a case where the community decided to negotiate the terms of the grant instead of opposing to it. This land grant proceeding comes from the town of San Bartolomé Huapalteopan in Coatepec, also very close to Mexico City, to the east of Lake Texcoco. On February 1st, 1580, Spaniard Antonio de Quijada requested a ranch for cattle in the outskirts of the town of San Miguel Tepetlapa, on a site where the community had already set up their houses and crops of agave plants. So here you got the community of San Miguel Tepetlapa, and again you see a very clear divide between the urban areas and the rural areas. The towns are always depicted in a very schematic way, with just a church and a few houses. And then you got this huge ravine that goes all the way up into the rural areas. And you got the town of Mazatlan Chapocho, Huapalteopan, and Amultepec. So between this ravine, the natives claimed that they had the ranches and also a plantation of agave plants. And Antonio de Quijada was requesting land in this area as well. So it is also interesting to notice in terms of what the painting means, that when the artist created this painting, he covered the entire surface. He didn't really leave any space for writing glosses or comments. And, the only ones that he did, he used purposefully. So when the Spaniards write on the painting, it looks forced and it is very difficult to read, because I am guessing, I don't really know, but they didn't really want, glosses were not welcome or necessary.
Sorry, are
Yes.
these rivers or streams or...
This is a ravine.
Is what?
A ravine, like a canyon.
Uh-huh. And is water going through there?
No. Natives from the town made various attempts to stop this grant, but Hernan and Maria Perez had a donation letter from the former governor that confirmed that he had granted the land to them. The couple asked the judge to add this document to the proceedings along with the written complaint. However, 2 days later, and for no clear reason, Hernan Perez returned and asked the mayor to give him back his letter of donation, as he no longer opposed to the grant. He said, and I quote, "I ask you to do not include the donation letter to the proceedings documents, because I know that I have little rights to these lands or none at all, and for this reason the letter has no power and no value. You can grant these lands to Antonio Quijada." So that's pretty shocking, and it's an unexpected move. But I think it forms part of a larger strategy, because the next day, Hernan Perez comes to the judge and he says, "We have realized that a grant on that place will bring us little harm, and Your Excellency can give the grant to Antonio Quijada, as long as," and that's the key, The grant lays away from the place where we have our cultivated fields and agave plants, and as long as the grant is issued from the path that goes from the ravine to San Clemente. So they say, yes, you can grant the land, but at the same time, they ask for a series of conditions to be met. And they also ask, we would like the judge to measure the extension of the said ranch and the land grant protecting us. And this, I am only showing you here a couple of cases, but when you go through the file, you realize that negotiation was usually much more successful than opposing to the grant, because in this case, the mayor accepts the conditions, so he grants the land to Quijada, but he also protects at least some areas that belong to the native community. And what's interesting about this is that when you look at the map, there is also a palimpsest, and you can probably see it because it's not really that well done. Underneath these agave plants, there used to be 3 houses. And these houses usually stood for a ranch, where people lived and they work on the fields and they kept the properties clean. So as the proceedings go on, these houses were deleted and covered up. Here is another infrared photography. So underneath the bark plants, the maguey plants, you can see the little houses.
Do you know the time that has passed between one map and another, or the intervention in the... You cannot measure that?
There is no way of knowing. You mean within this
Yeah.
case? It's
When
impossible to know. Because the case files don't mention the painting at all, they don't mention the artist, and many of the negotiations that happen are, of course, never registered. So what I have here is observation of the painting and trying to connect those testimonies together. But it's really interesting because the community negotiate, and the map seems to reflect these negotiations as well. The proceedings had a favorable outcome. The Spanish magistrate and petitioner accepted the conditions, and at least for the time being, they could keep their possessions. So lastly, a third case scenario is what happens. Individuals, natives, could also request tracts of land to keep their livestock, and these requests are of, although fewer in number than their Spanish counterparts, these requests are of note because they usually face no opposition and were swiftly approved, which indicates a favorable scenario for indigents within colonial land distribution. One such example is the case of Don Andrés de Arellano, the native governor of Pahuatlán. Pahuatlán is located to the north in the Sierra Norte de Puebla, to the northeast of Puebla and close to Veracruz. And as I mentioned to you, in this area, especially in the 16th century, Spaniards had fewer requests, so many leading men or principales requested territories in this area. This is a land grant map from Pahuatlán, Puebla. It was painted on April 1585 for the petitions of Don Andrés de Arellano. Arellano was the native governor of Pahuatlán, and he requested at least 3 different land grants in the Sierra Norte. So he ended accumulating a total of at least 6 ranches for raising his livestock between 1585 and 1599. He belonged to a group of nobles who owned several ranches for small livestock. He had inherited his charge from his mother, Juana de Arellano, who had been the cacica of Pahuatlán in the early 16th century. Noble families maintained their privileges in the 16th century, as the Spaniards respected their positions if they could prove descent from a ruling lineage. The map that he used as evidence for his land requests offers a panoramic view of the province of Pahuatlán, as opposed to other maps that focus only on a single town and its rural area. In this particular map, we see Pahuatlán, which was a head town, which means it had its own government and town council and received the tribute from the subject towns. And the painter included 4 other towns: San Andrés Ayala right here, San Miguel de Tlistaca here, Santa Maria Magdalena, and San Francisco Aguazotepec. The selection of towns is very interesting because in the 16th century, before and after the Spanish conquest, Pahuatlán was a regional capital of a larger province, and it had 26 towns subordinated to it. So to me, it was worth of note that only these 4 towns were included in the map. One might think that these towns could have been geographically contiguous. But if you look at any map, or in this case I did GIS software, georeference of the towns, to show you, Pahuatlán is right here, and San Andres Ayala, and Santa Maria Magdalena, etc. But there are many other towns in between. These are not exactly close to one another. And if you notice right here, there is a mountain and there are 2 lakes. Many other towns, and none of these are depicted. So that got me.
But you don't know if they're contemporary
Contemporary?
of the other 5. Can you say that?
Well, they were, because this record comes from
Okay.
Relaciones Geográficas. So many of these towns do not exist today, because after the congregaciones, they ceased to exist. But back then, when the painting was made, these 26 towns definitely existed. So, according to the surveys carried out in the 1570s. So, one possible explanation to this would be that the artist was referring to a political rather than a geographic link between these towns. Perhaps he only included in this map those towns ruled by Arellano's family in pre-conquest times, his Calpoli. If so, this map could also be highlighting the family's historical connection to the land and making reference to the former political ties, in hopes to obtain a land grant. I discuss this more fully in the book and compare it to other maps that have similar layouts. And I know that this is, very, very difficult to prove. But this is a very unusual connection between towns, and his was a very prominent family of noble descent, so it is a possibility. And I just want to finish the presentation by mentioning that it was not only the descendants of noble families who could request lands. In my book I discuss as well maps presented by commoners or macehuales who requested tracts of land, and these were also promptly approved by the mayor. One example is this map from the town of Ixtlahuacan, painted in 1597, and this supports the request of Don Baltasar, an Indio who needed 2 units of farmland for small cattle next to a hill located half a league from his town. This case was solved swiftly. The witnesses unanimously approved the grant, and Don Baltasar got his land in a matter of days. Here you got, this is the town of Jocotitlan, where he belongs, and this is a place name that names the town according to a pre-Colombian convention. A mountain nearby, and this is a place where Don Baltasar was requesting land. So he wanted this to be his ranch, but the ranch did not exist yet. It's present us in the future. So it was approved. And then you also have a relevant example from Tizayuca Hidalgo, painted in 1593 to support the petition of 3 Indians, Hipólito de la Corona, Rafael Hernández, and Adriano de Santa Cruz. So everybody had access to land grants, and even though indigenous requests are fewer than Spanish, you also have this, and they were, approved. So in conclusion, the analysis of land grant maps and the story of the proceedings they tell offer a more nuanced understanding of the problems brought about by land distribution and the complex interactions between indigenous communities, rivals, and Spaniards as they argued over territory during the first century of colonial rule. As the paintings and case files show, native communities participated actively in Spanish law and put together plans to defend their lands from controversial requests, negotiated the terms of the grants, or requested land themselves. Central to these cases was the work of the artists. The viceroy himself requested a painting for each one of the land grant proceedings. This bore the responsibility of conveying size and distance to him and other interested viewers. These images made possible the communication and exchange of ideas between all of the parties involved. Thank you very much for listening.
Questions? Who'd like to start?
Yes.
Is there? You looked at different regions around the central part of Mexico. Is there? Can one tell from the style of painting where they're from? Is there? Would you say there's a Puebla style as opposed to, I don't know, some other? And I mean, are there enough of these that one can identify certain styles, I suppose?
Yes, it is possible. There are some studies that have analyzed maps only from one region or only from one town in order to determine style. It is possible to distinguish a Michoacan style and a style from Puebla. Although in most cases this is difficult to do because in the 16th century the mendicant orders who are coming to the New World need indigenous painters to decorate the churches and to paint manuscripts. So at the same time they are teaching them in the atriums of the church how to paint according to European artistic techniques. And in these maps you see a whole range of experimentation that is almost as different as every painter, because some painters prefer to stick to their pre-Columbian training. In some you see more experimentation. But particularly in the 16th century you see, they're learning how to use perspective and they're learning how to use different pigments. So you can almost see their minds at work saying, I have all these new resources and I have been trained in these traditions. So in these paintings you see all of these coming together. So even though you can identify regional varieties, sometimes it is not possible because, artists from one town may travel to another, teach something to different painters and so on.
And in those cases where you can identify regional variation, are the different styles expressive of something? I mean, do they reflect some pre-Columbian characteristics of that region, or
it reflects?
Or is it just a painter's proclivities?
It reflects the way the land is conceptualized, rather. Connections between the artist and this particular landscape. An intimate knowledge of this, so to speak, rather than a particular... You can trace the style. I was thinking about Michoacan, for example. If Michoacan has this very beautiful painted manuscript called La Relación de Michoacan, and the houses and the human figures are very, very similar to what you see in these maps from Michoacan. So you see a personality, maybe.
Another question is, what kind of status did these painters have? I mean, were they, presumably if this was something that was requested from the Viceroy, then were they in great demand, and were they paid for these paintings, and if so, did that make them wealthy in some way?
Not wealthy. They couldn't charge. I don't know if they were paid for their services because there are no records. I do know that they were in great demand because, especially in the 1570s, there is a huge building campaign, and all of these churches had to be painted. All these beautiful murals that we have in 16th century convents were done by indigenous artists. So they were in great demand, and they traveled from one town to another sometimes. Manuscripts as well, and in these early stages of colonial rule there are not many Spanish map makers in New Spain, so most maps, not only for land grants but all the other genres, tribute and all these records, they were done by indigenous artists. I don't think they made much profit of it, but sometimes you can trace Barbara Mundi in her book about the Relaciones Geográficas. She identifies painters who have worked on the Relaciones Geográficas and on land grant maps based on style. So you can see that they are working. Most of the colonial project was done with indigenous maps, so they were still making them in the 16th century.